Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome to the second panel discussion of our event, To Accelerate to Net Zero. I hope you've all satisfactorily topped up your caffeine and energy levels and you're ready for this next conversation. And I hope you will enjoy this session on the role of corporates in building a climate-resilient South Africa. I am Nadia Elgra. I'm a manager with Carbon Trust Africa, and I have the honor of moderating this session and welcome you all to enjoy it. While the previous session focused upon why corporates should be looking at climate risks and how to manage those risks and how to take advantage of the opportunities, this session is more outward looking. So corporates in the broader context. So it's important for businesses to go beyond just an internal focus when formulating plans and strategies towards a climate-resilient business. But there's a need to be mindful of the connection between operational value chains and the communities and the environments in which the businesses or corporates operate. So how may corporates or businesses craft their futures in a changing environment such that there are no adverse impacts beyond the value chains? But better yet, how may businesses and corporates future-proof themselves, reaching for net zero, and contribute to the resilience of the greater community? I have the pleasure of introducing 4 panelists that we have up in front of us. Loshni Naidu, Chief Sustainability Officer from the JSE. Saul Levin, Executive Director from the Trade and Industry Policy Strategies, that's TIPS. Alexa Brown-Robinson, Senior Project Manager on Climate, Energy and Water from the NBI. And Ewald Kellerman, Group Head of Sustainability Strategy at ABSA. So I decided just to give it a very quick name and organization and allow them to introduce themselves with the 1-2-liner, just to let you know a little bit more about what they do from a day-to-day basis. All right, let me start with you, Loshni.
Well, thank you and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. So just very briefly, the JSE has taken sustainability as part of its core. So what that means is it sits at our corporate strategy, at our board level, executive level, and filters all the way down into the organization. And we do have a specific sustainability strategy that underpins each of those elements. And to talk to what Nadia mentioned about the outward focus, our strategy looks internally as well as outwardly. Because very key for us is we understand our role in the economy and how we can shape and influence and shift the dial towards sustainable development. We can unpack bits of our strategy and how it talks to some of the questions later, but just very briefly, that's us as the JSE.
Thank you, Loshni. Go ahead, Saul.
Hi, so TIPS is an economic policy research institute. We've done a fair amount of work on sustainable and inclusive industrialization, particularly around the just transition. And part of what we've been looking at is how to better understand the moves that the economy needs to take, should be taking, and is taking. So we've done research and also quite a lot of dialogue to engage on these various issues.
Thank you, Saul. Alexa.
Hi, and thanks for having all of us. It's a pleasure to be here today. So the National Business Initiative is a membership organization, and we work with our membership to understand what it means to reach net zero. So NBI has played a significant role in understanding that it's technically possible to reach net zero in South Africa, and from that platform then working towards what that means in the just transition itself, but with a particular focus at the moment in understanding what the skilling development that is required to meet that need.
Thanks, Alexa. Ewald.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. So I represent ABSA. Hopefully it doesn't need too much of an introduction, but I think that our role in society, our role in helping to empower the country and the continent on their sustainability journey is something that I'm hoping to promote here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Ewald, and thank you to all for doing a very brief introduction. All right, so this session I have split it up into 2, and the first session looking at why corporates should be looking beyond their business footprint. And beyond looking at business as usual, but looking at future-proofing, why look just beyond the footprint? And then the second component would be why? How? So once you have the why, how are you looking to affect the broader community? So rather not any impact, but positive impact. So I'm going to start off with a quote here. And the quote is, "Businesses that implement climate adaptation at the expense of the communities where they work could face additional risks from customer boycotts, investor pressure, and even employee activism." It's a pretty hardcore statement, I recognize that, but I think we're trying to jug some thoughts here. But I think something that I'd just like to highlight, and in our discussions with this panel prior to this day, the question was, are we focusing solely on adaptation? And I actually hadn't picked that up. I was thinking adaptation, we were looking at the better good, but there is also an aspect of mitigation beyond the footprint of a business. So I'm hoping to hear a little bit of thoughts on both perspectives. So we had already predetermined who would like to respond to this, so we're going to have some initial responses from each of the panel members and then follow-up responses. So Ewald, you're first up. Tell me your thoughts about this quote. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Nadia. So just briefly, my background is in risk management. I haven't been in sustainability formally until about a month ago, so immersing myself. But I think, if I look around the room, we've got a lot of very revered experts who've been studying and thinking about this concept for some time. From a risk perspective, as Chief Risk Officer, I try to sort of stretch my imagination a little bit longer and longer, going through different stress periods, realizing that, best time to plant a tree is 100 years ago or 50 years ago. Every single stress we went through, we sort of realized that we should have done something longer ago. And I started, pivoting my career into looking forward a lot more. So, studying future scenarios in Oxford and the Copenhagen Institute of Future Studies. I eventually took over scenario planning for the bank. And it's sort of a very easy move from risk management to resilience planning and then into sustainability. And I think what's becoming a lot more clear as you start lengthening your timeline of how you look forward is how important the environment is that you operate in. So thinking about the communities, stakeholders, our staff members, we are really interconnected, and there's a significant amount of contagion between actions of one party to the next. So the only way in the long run that we can really survive is to find a way of working together and supporting each other. And I think that the previous panel members spoke a lot about this, so I won't go into too much more detail. But I think if you consider what happened in Russia and Ukraine a couple of years ago, all of a sudden we realize that just-in-time isn't a concept that really works or builds resilience. It can save a bit of money in stock, but it doesn't really sort of build resilience. So nearshoring and onshoring became a lot more popular, and we took it out of the MBA curriculums. But I think that's just an example of how interconnected we are and how important it is to work together. Our success is dependent on our stakeholder success, our customer success. And even our competitors, it's important that we work together as an industry, to work through climate adaptation. So I haven't given you a lot on adaptation specifically, but hopefully help to set the scene for where we're heading.
No, I think it also piggybacks on the previous session, which is collaboration, working together. And doing this in isolation is just setting up for failure, correct? Alexa, would you like to add on to those thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I want to make the point that, and Lauren, you said it very well in the previous panel, that businesses and corporates, especially large corporates, are not working in a vacuum. They're not isolated. They are within an ecosystem. An ecosystem of stakeholders, an ecosystem of a landscape of policy, whether you're talking about financial policy, industrial policy, or climate policy itself. And then added to that, there's also the fact that businesses cannot survive unless they have inputs. So if you have your input materials, you've got your workforce, which provides an input to your operations, and you've got your trade agreements as well. And all three of those aspects are all very vulnerable to climate change, and not only climate change, but a transition as well. So there are transition risks as we start decarbonizing and moving towards green economies. There are risks to those inputs to a business. And so if a business is not thinking about their position in that ecosystem, they are essentially not thinking about their own resilience. And that's inwards looking, but then outwards looking, they play a role because of the influence and the impact that they have back onto those systems and the regional economies that they function within. So it really is a systems approach, as we've been talking about this morning, and really, really important that businesses understand that they are not just developing a climate strategy or an adaptation strategy or a mitigation strategy, but really being change agents in developing resilience in an ecosystem.
I like that. Change agents. That's a good word. And I think the power of the private sector, while we may have an idea of it, is not being realized just to its truest extent. And I think the ecosystem view is fantastic. You know, systems approach the whole of the system in one is a good view. I always picture a number of cogs, and you know, if you have one cog that starts slowing down or not turning at all, the entire system seems to crash down, and that each of them has inputs at various points. So I like the ecosystem approach. So, would you like to add on to those? Any questions for the fellow panelists?
I mean, my comments feed off what Alexa's saying. And sorry, apologies for my voice. I've got sinus things going on here, so change of season doesn't help. I don't normally talk like a frog. Yeah, so for me, there's two things that come out of all of this. So the first one is the move away from fossil fuels, and individual company decisions to move away from fossil fuels has an impact on the communities and the types of jobs that are created. So if we see, you know, coal mines at some point will start scaling back, or they're not hiring new employees. Same with Eskom decommissioning. Same things are going to start happening with Sasol at some point. So if we look at what's going on in these areas, there's going to be different types of jobs that are needed. And when we've engaged with communities, often workers in the factories or the plants are saying, but what about my children? Where are my children going to get jobs from? And so there's definitely something that we can think about in the how section of our discussion later. But that becomes a real risk and a real problem where people are worried about their future because they can see this move away from fossil fuels, and the types of industries and the shifts that are happening are going to have this outcome. The second issue is that the impact of climate change is often worse for poorer communities. So one of the things, I mean, people were mentioning the Durban floods earlier. If you don't have a proper house, or you've built on a precarious piece of infrastructure, your house gets washed away. We saw all of that happening. But it's the smaller stuff where, you know, the extreme droughts that we have started to have and are going to be exacerbated, impacts on food security, impacts on sustainable livelihoods. So your ability as a poorer household to be more resilient becomes compromised with climate change. So that has impacts on a whole range of things, but one of which is, where do people live? Do they start moving to Gauteng, for example, because where they are is just not economically viable? So it's how we think about our cities going forward. It's how we think about broader economic development in different parts of the country that are going to be impacted more harshly by climate change. So, I mean, I kept telling people earlier this year that we're in one of the worst droughts in southern Africa, and they're saying, but it keeps raining in Joburg. So you know, there's a reality that certain parts of the country are going to be worse impacted by climate change than others. And so we have to think about that in terms of you know, where we take you know, some of the corporate responsibility and how corporates see themselves as corporate citizens in responding to some of these things. But we can get to that discussion.
Okay, thank you, Saul. was also very interesting as well. Ah, I'm back on. Lashni, any last thoughts on this quote?
Thank you. Okay. So just 2 points. And building on some of the things that we've heard in the previous panel as well as what's been said here. The first one is around where corporates are sitting. Well, actually, let's take a step back. Where companies are sitting on this value chain. If you're a big multinational corporate, you have exposure to latest technology, latest thinking, and you probably have the resources and the ability to think about the why, how does this impact me as my business, its business sustainability, and have the ability to think about, well, how do I respond? And what do I need to integrate into systems, processes, people, whatever. But if you are, like we've talked about earlier, an SMME who is a two-man operation, you're not even thinking about climate change. You probably don't even know, what is this and what does it have to do with me? So I think it really does depend where we're at on that spectrum of maturity, and that impacts your ability to think about why, approach from a systems thinking, as well as approaching from an how. How do I integrate this? How do I respond? And I think there's a lot of work, and we can unpack how a little later, and some of the great work AP and Bev is doing. But the second point I wanted to talk about was just mentioned quickly, is we're focusing it from a risk perspective, and nothing wrong with that at all. But it's hopefully that we don't get stuck there, and to transition some of our thinking into what's the opportunity here. Because I think there's a saying that says, out of adversity comes opportunity, or something like that. So it's looking for the opportunities that will solve our climate issues, but at the same time resolve some other issues as well. So it's not just about growing your business, but how do we respond to the existential crisis, to respond to poverty, unemployment. If we can do that by tapping into those opportunities, that would be awesome.
But it's true, we're actually quite a negative group of thinkers, right, on the world. And it sometimes is hard to take that moment to pause and say, but where is the opportunity? And to expand any opportunity that a business or corporate might see to the greater good. So I think it's a valuable comment to make, that let's not just focus on the risks and what could go wrong. It's just look, where can we make the right things even bigger and better, right? All right, I'm just mindful of time, and we do have time for questions and answers later on, so just to let you all know. So we're going to move on to the how, and unfortunately our system is still coming online, so I hope you will bear with me as I read this out. It is critical that public and private sector organizations work in tandem to create an enabling environment, leveraging both policies and economic incentives to help business-led climate adaptation properly take off. The role of governments and the financial markets will be critical to move the needle in this space. There's a few key words that are perfect to our context, and I'm seeing economic incentives, governments, and financial markets. And we also did chat about that very briefly, and we ended up centering around the finance aspect. And we thought, well, there's actually more to this. And so we were happy that this quote brings in the policies, the governments, and the economic incentives. So I'm going to switch up the order here a little bit, and we're going to allow Lashni to have her first say about this quote. Would you like to have it in front of you, or you?
No, I'm good.
Oh.
There were 3 things that I did want to mention. So the first one is around innovation. And we've heard about, for example, green hydrogen this morning. So I want to take innovation broader than just linking it to technology. So it's looking at innovation from a business model perspective. So what are you doing as a corporate to be able to respond to climate risks, whether it's adaptation, mitigation, but what are you doing other than just looking for the technology that could solve this? And it's just being a bit more open in terms of how do you look at innovation. And I wanted to use us as an example, the JSE, from a financial markets perspective. And Tasha's done a brilliant job doing the lead up into it around financial instruments. Because we are constantly looking at, well, from our role in the capital markets, what do we do to mobilize that capital towards sustainable development? And we've got a couple of things which I'm just going to mention quite quickly. It's our sustainability segment, where we've got a host of green bonds, social bonds, sustainability-linked loans. We launched the segment in 2020. We had 11 at that point. This year we have, at the end of March, 78 bonds, which is great. We're still doing a whole lot of things to try and increase that. We launched a voluntary carbon market last year. We have a private placement platform which tries to link private companies with looking for funding, and a lot of these projects are focused in the renewable energy space, social infrastructure, affordable housing. So it's looking at, well, how do you reinvent or continuously try and push that boundary to create that innovation? Because some of the solutions are not going to be what we do currently. You know, to try and solve these problems, we can't be doing the same thing we've been doing. The second point that I want to raise was around partnerships and collaboration. Not to echo, but just to re-emphasize what was said earlier, what we found with our voice as the JSC on the continent, we try to participate and engage and influence conversations in a positive direction. You know, it's our role. We try and support the NBI locally. We're part of international forums where we try to bring that emerging market voice. Because what we do find a lot of corporates say to us is that, and I think you've heard this in quite a few panels and events, where you've got Global North prescribing a whole lot of things, and thou shalt, and the rest, we're not saying we shouldn't be doing this, but the Global South trying to play catch up within their context, which is quite challenging in most instances. The third one and the last one, and this is just the how part, and we talked about it earlier, it's about the internal and outward. What we found, you know, in conversations, as well as my previous roles before getting to the JSC, the starting point for most corporates is inward. Trying to understand, what does this actually mean for me? How do I adapt my business model? How do I respond to those risks before moving on to outward? And it's a very natural progression. So one of the things we've just started doing is mapping our supply chain. You know, we've committed to net zero, but it is an inward focus, looking at our products, our services, our training, awareness raising. But now it's moving outwards, where we look at our supply chain and see, well, how do we support that supply chain and understand what are they doing around climate? I'll stop there.
It's a bit of a process, right? But I like the fact that you brought up innovation and doing things differently. I mean, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing different and expecting the same result. But it also means making mistakes and being okay with those mistakes, right? So, natural progression.
Okay. So a key issue here is for us is the structure of the economy. We have a history of very intensive, capital-intensive, energy-intensive industry, and that industry hasn't created the kind of jobs downstream that we need in order to reduce our unemployment and get a certain level of economic growth. The pressures of climate change and moving away from fossil fuels then exacerbates that. So part of it is our smelters are very energy intensive. Some of them are looking at greening. Some of them, the costs may be astronomical. And how do they think about their future operations when they're facing trade barriers, if they're carbon intensive, and can they get in renewables in order to, you know, it's enough to power a small city that they use in one operation. So there's a lot of, and sometimes even a big city if you're looking at the smelters in Richards Bay. So I think part of it is, if we want to think about a future that's less energy intensive and a future that's more job intensive and labor intensive, how does our economy look like? And Mahendra spoke to some of those things earlier when he was talking about what the IDC's role is. But these things are not just things that government needs to do or development finance. It's the role of corporates and companies in thinking about, you know, do they set up new operations? What type of industries do they have? Where are the jobs being created? Where do they physically locate plants? So if, as I was saying earlier, one of the impacts of the move away from fossil fuels is on mines in Mpumalanga. What happens to all the support industries around that? They've got a lot of capabilities. There's engineers who've been doing work for mines and for Eskom for decades. There's a lot of firm capabilities. Are there alternatives to pivot and set up new plants, new operations that are able to change the structure of that particular economy, but the broader economy as well, and move us onto a different trajectory? So these are some of the big economic issues, but we have to confront them. These are not things that we can say, let someone else think about that, because if we want a future that's, in a future country or future planet, we're going to need to think about how we have, the jobs that we create, our role in society, and where we participate in terms of the economic role that companies play. And, my last point is that, we have targets or measures around CSR, so it's 1% of NPAT or 1.3 depending on your company. Should we not be looking at saying, is there something that corporates need to do to put into communities, put into a different trajectory, so that we say, okay, 1% or 2%, we may not be returning it to shareholders immediately, but it's something where shareholders know that at least work is happening to ensure future of the corporate and the country. Thanks.
I guess, Larshni, it almost supersedes those as well. Actually, while you're looking internally, look at the opportunities externally. So understanding your own businesses and the supply chains, and not necessarily, but I guess which one comes first, right?
Well, actually, you're doing both at the same time.
Yeah.
It's really a hard juggling act, because of quote I keep saying when people ask me about this role, we're honestly building that plane as we're flying. Which is pretty much, I think, what a lot of corporates are trying to do right now. Because it is a genuine struggle to, for example, decarbonize ourselves. I mean, we're building in the middle of Sandton, trying to replace our Eskom use, as well as our generators, the diesel, our travel. It is a challenge, especially when you've made, for example, net zero commitments, science-based targets, etc. But we stand by it. But when we compare and we have the engagements with other exchanges globally, somebody makes a commitment and off they go in a month, because their entire generation capacity has been decarbonized. Their grid's decarbonized already, so it's not a challenge. But we do want to push the boundaries, but we're also quite cognizant that we need to walk the talk. So we need to be putting things in place, but we need to facilitate these conversations, and we need to be innovative in terms of how do we mobilize that capital.
Yep. Good. Thank you. Alexa, anything to add?
Yeah, so a few points to add to the rich discussion that's already happening, but I think the points that I want to make are that business and the private sector, large corporates, SMMEs, they need to participate. That's the key word here that I want to highlight, is participation. You need to participate in conversations, in action, in your reporting, in your understanding. And it's not easy to just walk into a space in an emerging market or in an area that there are opportunities that are emerging. But that participation is then key to understanding this landscape. And that's where the role of intermediaries comes in. So organizations that you find that are facilitating and convening these platforms, that can provide that thought leadership and and the understanding of what the landscape is looking like. And that enables the participation. And then the mechanisms of how to actually act on that will then follow. So depending on what the interests are, whether it's your water security or your harvests, like AB InBev came with many, many good examples today. Whether you're looking at your harvests on an annual basis, or you're looking at your supply chains, or the vulnerabilities of your workforce. Whatever your risks are that you're trying to address, there will be mechanisms to address those. And Yes, so I think that is the point that I just want to drive, is that participation is so important in an emerging market, and an emerging market that provides opportunities towards net zero.
Participation, nice word, alongside collaboration, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And we saw that happening in the previous panel.
Absolutely, that came through strongly. I was actually getting worried that we might not need to have this session. Ewald,
Thanks. I'm fortunate that my colleagues already mentioned a lot of the points which I prepared, so I'll have to make up something on the spot. But aside from agreeing to what I've heard, and that was articulated really well by this panel as well as the previous one, I think some of the biggest challenges towards sort of linking the sustainability actions to economic realities, it relates to the data discussion in the previous conversation. So, at the moment, it's very difficult to explain to stakeholders in non-financial terms, why you make certain business decisions. If you think about the sort of old realities of sustainability, you're not maximizing profit, you're introducing a new constraint. So does that potentially reduce profit? The second part of that equation is obviously cutting off tail risks, so reducing all sorts of tail risks, so you can get your return to be slightly better, but it doesn't balance out yet. I think we probably need to work towards a mechanism where we can measure and quantify and explain what the impact is of the long-term decisions on what we've got at the moment, and I think that would help unlock a lot of the opportunities. So as a corporate, I mean, we at the moment are expected, and we enjoy making sort of bets on the long term, and we often sort of do things where there's no measurements available. So largely similar to sort of building the plane while it's flying. We invest in projects that create carbon credits, and we look at how can we sort of retire those in a way that it doesn't reflect on us as if we're just trying to deflect our responsibility. But the reality is that there's very little of a business case for it as we stand at the moment. So we need to be innovative in the way that we approach it. But I think while we championing the sustainability type of initiatives, we also need to make sure that we bring the rest of the financial and economic community along. And that would require better measurements and better ways of articulating the value that we bring. I think that could help to advance the role of corporates in this space.
I think I'd want to add, alongside data and making sure that we understand impact, is transparency as well. That as soon as information and data is available, share that so that it is a broader benefit. Thank you. All right, I know there was a question to have questions, and so now is the time for your questions. We've heard from our panel, and so please, I do believe we have a roving mic. Turon is grabbing it for us. So please, anybody have a question, raise your hand, your name and your organization, please. And then if you have a question directly to a panel member, please let them know. Jared, our keynote speaker.
Okay, thank you, Jared Mudley from the JETPMU. Saul, you've triggered something, and let me just be very frank on this. I've got a vested interest in this question. We often speak about policy reform. It's getting a lot of focus right now in electricity, but you touched on CSI, and one of the points we sort of engaging with right now with funders on a JET funding platform is a lot of that CSI funding is regulated by, let's say, Section 30 of the Income Tax Act, and I don't think those. I don't think those pieces of policy or legislation or regulation have been reviewed for quite some time. So, do you think, and maybe it's a question to all the panel members, what role do you think your institutions can play in really bringing forward some of these points and lobbying for change with some of those legislations or regulations, so that corporates can actually direct their CSI funding to maybe more fit-for-purpose investments that are needed right now? Thanks.
Thank you, Jared. Perhaps we can take one more question, and then we can... Oh, there we go.
Thank you. My name is Tato Wesi. I'm a startup within the space, carbon capture utilization, reusing the captured carbon for fertilizer. So my question is, what efforts do you do in terms of awareness? Because I've noticed that there's a lot of missing information, and not just to SMEs, and I'm talking about even policymakers. What efforts does your organizations do towards involving all stakeholders, because climate change does affect, everyone, especially the poorest of the poorest, you see, with the floods and all of that happening. So what efforts do you do in terms of partnerships? And also adding to the first question, in terms of financing and investment, what efforts do you do to ensure that there's a lot of effort that is put into informing everyone? Because we tend to sit here and speak amongst ourselves, but we're not involving people that are really the policy makers that need to, be involved in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's head over to Jared's question around what corporates could do to change the status quo in terms of CSI. Saul, I think it was originally directed at you, so good start, yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's part of it is CSI, but part of it is corporates saying we need to have a long-range view on what does our corporate look like and our role in society. So some of these things are not just around CSI, it's expanding that remit. But I agree, yes, we do need to look at, can corporates benefit from that? Are there tax exemptions? And that's really where the role of the state comes in to say, let's help corporates pivot in a different direction through policy and regulation. So I think there's definitely a role for that, and maybe we should have another breakfast and we can chat about it. Because there's definitely something that can be done to look at existing legislation to say, how do we see things that need to be done differently in the world, and use the levers that are available to direct positive action.
So can I tack on to the CSI question? So this is a caution that I think the approach should be a system approach, because there's a potential for unintended consequences. Because if you look at how corporates spend that CSI budget, some of the programs or initiatives that they support are smaller, more local community development type examples. So it's not necessarily, it will have the impact nationally, but for that local community within which they operate, it has a dramatic and significant impact on their livelihoods and how it shapes that community. So I'm not saying this is a bad thing, and maybe it is time to revisit, but the approach should be a wider look at all the various stakeholders, and if you shift a lever, what are the potential consequences down the line? Thanks.
Alexa Ewald, any thoughts either to Jared's question or the issue around awareness raising?
Yeah, so I'll answer Tatu's question, and I've got a lot of respect for Carbon Capture as a startup, with their goal of sort of helping businesses sort of transition and sort of manage their process. In fact, ABSA is quite interested in partnering with Carbon Capture to see how we can help our clients. I think to answer the question directly, what are we doing, or we're probably not doing enough yet. We talk a lot about sort of internal capability building, so we've got a lot of investment in our own capabilities, but I think very soon that will have to go out externally. And there's a couple of challenges. So firstly, it's a technical concept. There's very little average Joe sitting in the room. Most of the conference attendees have some sort of background. If you try and explain to your family what you do, and I've recently changed jobs to this, it is quite difficult to do that in a sentence or two. And as we sort of go through the process, set our journeys with our customers and do that client engagement, we also find out, we learn a lot about their industries. They learn a lot about their decarbonization journeys. But the science is tricky, it's difficult, and it's still a moving target. So, I think what we can do is we can start extending some of our capability build that we do internally, externally, but also start having the conversations with our customers to talk about their journeys. But it is certainly a very big challenge to acknowledge, and one that I don't think anybody's in a position to solve now, other than making sure we keep chipping away at it.
Thank you, Saul. Alexa.
Yeah, thanks. I have a few thoughts, and I just want to reflect on Jared's question about CSI, and I don't have an answer for you. I actually have the same question. But I just wanted to add that, just add my voice and say that I think it is very important around the CSI aspect to start thinking about reforms around it, because the scale of finance and the scale of effort that is needed to start transitioning a country to a low carbon and climate resilient society requires far more than just CSI. So if it is to be packaged within a CSI, it needs reform. So I echo your question. And then the question around SMMEs and the engagement with SMMEs, I think it's a brilliant question, and something that is coming up and is being it is highlighted very much at the moment because of the impact down value chains, starting with upstream corporates, and then understanding their impacts and their dependencies down value chains. So it's becoming critical to have good engagement down those value chains, and then understanding what the return is on the benefit and the positive impact along those value chains, not only for the corporates and the SMMEs, but also for general sustainable development in the country. So I think, practically speaking, I think the Presidential Climate Commission has made a good effort in making dedicated and concerted effort to community engagement. That's specific to the Just Transition, also specific to Mpumalanga, but I think in that there's a learning of the critical need to factor that into initiatives and programs, whether it's community engagement or SME engagement or small business.
It's an interesting example you pulled out there. Thank you.
Thanks.
I recognize we only had 2 questions, but there is still time afterwards, and I've been given the 2-minute warning from the back of the room. And, oh, sorry, Sasha. No, unfortunately not. I'm also mindful that we are, oh, okay, I'm getting the yes, please. Nadine says, please go ahead. Sorry, Sasha, thank you.
Thanks. Lashni, it's a question for you. So you mentioned 78 issuances on the sustainability segment, which is really positive, as you say, but obviously you're looking to drive more activity. I understand there's also now a transition segment. To my knowledge, there's no issuances off that. Am I right or not?
You're correct.
Okay. No, when was that launched, and how much marketing or awareness building are you doing around that? And have you had much interest from issuers considering that? Because I think transition for me is it's critical, actually.
It is. So with our capital markets team, where this sits with, so there's 2 things, actually there's 3 initiatives we're launching, and we'll make an announcement now at the end of May. Both 2 pieces will be specific targeted training with bond issuers to try and see, just what is it, how do we go about putting a bond together, but just trying to upskill and elevate the level of understanding so that we can increase the number of issuances. The second, so there's 2 pieces of work related to that, and the third is a research piece of work that we want to start to understand what are the challenges and the hindrances to actually getting this, not just the transition segment, but that entire sustainability segment. So across the board, all our bonds, why are we not getting the traction that we do want? And we do know there are challenges we're kind of aware of, but we want to see, other than identifying those challenges, what are the mechanisms that we can put in place that will unlock it? So how do we work around or work through those issues?
Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. I was wondering where we would sit with time. And I had actually prepared one last question for each of the panelists. So if you can try in 10 seconds each. Let's say in 2030, I think I said 2030 to each of you, so that's 7 years, 6 years. what is the conversation going to be like? So we've had this conversation. Let's say everybody runs out and does their best, and we see movement. What is the situation going to look like in 2030? Are we still going to have the same conversations? So, Larshni, like a quick one.
Yes, unfortunately. I know you said be an optimist, and I was trying to be the eternal optimist. I think we would have shifted the dial in certain areas, but I think just looking back in the last 3-4 years, I think we're still going to have the same conversation on certain issues. And like one of the questions around awareness raising, that we are still trying to explain certain fundamental definitions, defining sustainability versus ESG. So unfortunately, I think we can still have very similar conversations, but I do believe, the eternal optimist, that we would have made impact in certain areas.
Okay, good.
So there was an article in The Guardian yesterday where they polled scientists who said that the majority of whom said we're going to miss these climate targets. They're all looking at 3-4% of temperatures above pre-industrial times. In 6 or 7 years, we can't be having the same conversation because we'll be seeing a lot more climate impacts. And so corporates, as citizens, as looking at the future, are going to have to say, what is our role to reduce carbon emissions, to support transition at a broader economic level, and to make sure that we still have a planet in the future. So, yeah.
It's a case of we can't. We simply can't be saying the same things, right? Alexa?
Yeah, so my statement is completely aspirational and depends on many things. But by 2030, we want to be having that conversation about reaching our NDCs, the 2030 NDCs, and tracking towards a 1.5 degree world. That is the conversation we want to have. And for that, we need to be talking about, at the same time, the huge rollout of renewable energies, the water security and the biodiversity security that we have achieved, measurably achieved, and that the communities that are being supported along the way.
Measurably. Needing data. Ewald.
So to keep it very short, I think a very positive South African story. In the early 90s, we developed the Montvleur scenarios that helped us to transition to a new democracy. And as a sort of use of scenario planning, that's probably still one of the world's best examples. Now, we've got the opportunity to be transformative in that way as well, to decide on, what are the potential futures, and obviously there's some bad news that we're sitting here doing the same thing, and there's some aspirational ones that we're in a better position. But at this stage, if we start planting those trees today, we can actually make a difference to move towards them. In 2030, I think climate hazards and the urgency would pick up a lot. It wouldn't just be us, maybe we would rent out the other rooms, take out these partitions and increase the conference size to 1,000 people. But I think we've got the unique opportunity to start making that difference early on, and to try and veer us away from the biggest disasters that we can avoid. So I'm also in the optimist camp.
Oh, good to hear. Group of optimists. Larshni, Saul, Alexa, and Ewald, thank you so much for your time today and your willingness to be honest and candid. I really appreciate it, and taking on the questions and throwing the quotations. So thank you very much for your time. To the audience, I'm sure there will be still some questions and some points for engagement. Our panel members will be outside, and so please do take a moment to engage in when you want or when you can. All right, so we are at the end. So I'd like to invite Geraldine Morris maybe up to the stage to do closure. Geraldine, would you like for the panel to take a seat, or are you happy? I think just in terms of time. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Wow. I have really enjoyed the discussions today, and I hope you have all as well. I was frantically trying to put together some notes to try and give a bit of a wrap-up of today's session. I have really been inspired, I've been challenged, and come away with many, many thoughts and notes and some great new connections from today, so thank you very much. So In summarizing today's event, not an easy task, I think, but there have definitely been some themes that have come up again and again. And so I'm going to do my best to be as brief as possible, but please bear with me. I know I'm between you and lunch and some further interesting discussions. We've heard today many examples of practical and impactful responses to climate change and to its impact. So we can definitely see that good work is being done in many spaces, but much more can be done. Our keynote speaker reminded us that we have a clear policy guide in South Africa for our decarbonization journey. We have our NDCs, we do have a net zero vision as articulated in our low emissions development strategy. We have our Just Energy Transition investment plan and implementation plan, which set out very clearly the goals for the next 3 to 5 years. We also have the imminent promulgation of our climate change bill, which will hopefully soon become an act that also just increases that policy certainty that we need in the space to galvanize action. So these are indeed strong policy enablers for the public and the private sector to work together to mobilize innovation and finance towards solutions to be achieved towards these goals and to ensure that South Africa remains a globally competitive and relevant country in terms of climate change and what we need to do. We also need to ensure that we continue to work collaboratively locally and with our global partners to find further pragmatic pathways towards net zero. We've spoken today about the critical element of justice that needs to be embedded in everything that we do as part of this journey. We've heard commitments from various speakers and their organizations, both in the public space and the private sector, to decarbonize and move towards net zero, again through a just transition, highlighting the very practical and pragmatic solutions and initiatives that are already underway. And I was very heartened to hear about some of these really important initiatives that are already underway. We heard about the importance of data, that we need to build a robust evidence base, not only for policy and decision makers, but I think to foster better collaboration and support, to help us understand the needs of our customers, of our suppliers, and for all of the stakeholders that we work with. Clear recognition that this is indeed a journey, and that the transition presents both risks and opportunities. We've seen the strong need for collaboration, for innovation. We've mentioned that when support is provided to clients, customers, and suppliers, how important and critical that is, and that those who should be, or who can rather, should be our leaders and our change makers. Again, we've heard the need for more action and for more collaboration and ambition. We've heard about the many opportunities for industrial growth through sustainable industrialization, leveraging the opportunities for green growth, for economic diversification into more green and clean sectors, and for support and innovation, and the work that many are doing in this space. Finally, extending the theme of collaboration to skills development and capacity building, so I'm starting to struggle to read my scribbles here, as well as to ensure funding for, again, the practical implementation and real projects on the ground. And this is something we've been hearing more and more of in our work as the Carbon Trust. People are wanting to see real projects on the ground and move beyond theory and discussions. So collaboration, I think, was definitely the main theme of today, as well as recognition that all of those involved are interconnected. Our businesses, the environment, communities, and workers. Nothing exists in a vacuum, I think, as one of our speakers said. We are all part of an ecosystem. We have a responsibility, therefore, not only to our shareholders as corporates, but to this ecosystem. We need to work together to ensure that we have a successful and just transition towards net zero. And on that note, Thanks again very much to our moderators, to our speakers, and to all of you for joining us in person and online. Those of you who are here in person, as we mentioned, we do have some lunch outside. I'm sure there's a lot more discussions and questions to be had. Those online, I have seen occasionally that a few things have popped up in the chat. No doubt there are some questions there as well, and I'm sure we will take note of them and we'll do our best to try and give some feedback to those of you who are online who have presented some questions and have sought to collaborate with us today. So thank you very much again to everyone.